So, how long do you think we'll be here? I'm not talking to you.
Hi guys, welcome back or welcome to Switch to Life. And in today's video, we're going to be switching it up and we're going to do a review of Transformers 1. So this is a prequel to the entire Transformers franchise. Which timeline of Transformers? I'm not really sure. In fact, I think it's its own timeline, so technically a reboot. It's really confusing. But what you do have to know is that this movie talks about the origin story of how Optimus Prime and Megatron became to be sworn enemies when before they were best friends, Orion Pax and D16. And yes, while all of the Transformers movies and especially the TV shows are basically glorified toy commercials, this doesn't actually feel like it. It feels like an actually good movie. So how does it compare to the rest of the Transformers franchise? Honestly, it's up there because, in my opinion, this is the single greatest thing that has ever happened to the Transformers franchise. Granted, that's probably just my opinion and it's not going to be everybody else's, and I haven't even seen all the Transformers media, so keep that in mind. But honestly, this movie was phenomenal. And a very big reason for that is because this movie was actually pretty funny. I really enjoyed the humor for this, not just because of all the Transformers references, but also just because the humor itself and the line deliveries were great. Now, let's talk about the animation. Animation was really good. I honestly hate to say it, but I really enjoyed it, especially the action sequences, not to mention how the characters would transform. I do have one complaint about how the characters have faces. I'm not really critiquing that. I'm just critiquing the fact that they have normal lips instead of just jaws on hinges, which, if you ask me, it does make the Transformers come across as a bit more human, when in reality they're metallic creatures. So maybe it works and maybe it doesn't. But honestly, know what? I'm okay with it because it's good for showing the emotions that these characters have. Speaking of, let's talk about the characters and their voices. The voice acting for this film was extremely great, especially when it came to Chris Hemsworth as Orion Pax. And yes, he's definitely no Optimus Prime, but that's the thing. This movie isn't about Optimus Prime. It's about Orion Pax before he became Optimus Prime. So Chris Hemsworth does an amazing job as a young Optimus. And also, the rest of the voice actors do a great job, especially Scarlett Johansson. She definitely brought herself into the role of Elita 1. And of course, who could forget Keegan-Michael Key as Bumblebee? Normally, Bumblebee is a mute character, but this time they're really leaning into him talking. Granted, he does know when to shut up, which is good, but also he's the only one who seems to actually want to have a conversation sometimes, which, again, is really good. It's kind of his character. I do want to talk about how great the other voice actors were, but unfortunately that's kind of spoiler territory, so let's move on. I really enjoyed the sound design. The sound design in this movie was metal. No, seriously, I'm not kidding. The sound design was literally just metal banging against metal, but it was done so great, and I love how they did it with every single footstep that these characters had, because, you know, they're made of metal. But the last thing to talk about is the music. There's not really any pop culture songs in this movie, which is great in and of itself. As for the soundtrack, I'm not really sure what I think about it. Granted, it's not really obnoxious. There's no point where it's trying to take over, which is great. It only adds to the story, and it's great that they have emotional music added in. I can't say that it's really memorable, but honestly, I was just sucked into the story of the movie that I completely forgot about trying to keep my ear out for the music. So whether it's good or bad, I'm not sure. Okay, so now let's talk about the story. We'll get into spoilers later, but here's a rough idea. Like I said, this movie is about how two best friends, Orion Pax and D16, would eventually become sworn enemies, Optimus Prime and Megatron. And I gotta say that the movie was extremely enjoyable, and from what I gather, it's great for both audiences who love the Transformers franchise and know all the lore, and it's also great for casual viewers who know nothing about Transformers except it's about robots that turn into vehicles. So the story itself is kind of predictable. Granted, going into the movie theater, I had no idea what to expect with the story, but as I was watching the movie, I was like, oh, okay, so this is what's gonna happen. So just 10 minutes into the movie, and I already knew exactly how the story was gonna go. But to be honest, I didn't really care. I was just sucked into the story, not because it was supposed to be full of twists and turns, but because it's about the characters interacting. This isn't supposed to be action, action, action. This is character-driven story. Which, if you ask me, is the real reason why this movie might just be the greatest movie that has ever hit the big screen for the Transformers franchise. Because all of those live-action movies, they mostly focused on the human characters and reduced the Autobots to, let's fight off the Decepticons so the humans can do what they need to do. Well, all of the movies except for Bumblebee. That one was actually pretty good. But what makes this movie awesome is that it actually makes the Transformers into likable characters that we can relate to on a personal level. That's actually where this movie shines. Not so much its story, but more so its characters and writing. But that does not mean that the story is bad. The story is actually great. With that in mind, we've actually reached the spoiler part of the video. So if you haven't seen it already, go and watch Transformers 1 in theaters right now. And if you haven't seen it, or you simply just don't care, feel free to stick around. So the story is that Orion Pax and D16 are best friends, but they are non-cogs, which means that they don't have a vital piece of instrument inside their core that makes it so that they can transform. They're just lowly worker bots that have no reason for existing except to mine energon. And I love how the movie introduces us to the lore of Cybertron, the planet, in that the Great Primus was actually pretty much a god to these guys, and he sacrificed himself to turn himself into the planet. And since then, energon has been flowing from the planet as a life source for all of the Transformers, with the Primes being the safeguards. Unfortunately, the Primes ended up dying, and the matrix of leadership was lost. And so energon stopped flowing, and now the miners have to mine for energon so that Transformers can stay alive. Luckily, they do have one source of leadership, and that is Sentinel Prime. And Sentinel Prime is a really great character, especially because he's always looking out for the little guy. But anyway, Orion Pax manages to somehow trick D16 into participating in the Iacon 5000, which is basically this big race that all of the Transformers can participate in, except for non-cogs. But Orion Pax and D16, despite being non-cogs, participate in the race. The two of them give the Transformers a run for their money and even manage to get in the lead right at the finish line, only to be passed at the last second by pretty much all of the Transformers. Well, except for the ones who crashed and ended up in last place. Anyway, Sentinel Prime congratulates Orion Pax and D16 on a job well done in the race and inspiring all of the other lowly miners into working harder, which is really great. Unfortunately, thanks to another Transformer named Darkwing, the two of them are banished to the very bottom of the planet, sub-level 50, despite the fact that there's only supposed to be 40 sub-levels. And it's there that they meet B-127, or should I say,
Balasatron.
Yes, that is literally how you pronounce his name. But anyway,
Balasatron
is going to one day turn into Bumblebee. So for the sake of this video and my own voice, I'm going to just call him B. Anyway, B introduces Orion and D16 to a couple of his friends, who are literally just statues made of trash. My personal favorite is Steve, even though Orion does kill the guy. And when Orion kills Steve, he discovers that Steve actually has a tracking beacon with a message that leads to Alpha Trion, and it's leading them to the place where the Primes had their final battle against the Quintessons, a bunch of alien monsters who are trying to take over Cybertron and Energon for themselves. So the three of them try to sneak onto a waste transport so that they can go to the surface and find the place where the primes died. And in the process, they are thwarted by another non-cog named Alita, who is trying to find her way to work up the ranks so that she can make a better life for herself. And so the four of them go on a journey across the surface of Cybertron, which is pretty much a wasteland that's constantly transforming, which again makes sense since the planet is literally a giant transformer who's dead. So after making a long trek, the gang discovers that there are Quintessons on the planet, and that's really bad because it means that they're being hunted. But they go to the coordinates and they discover the place where most of the primes died. The only one who's still alive, and the reason that the message is still going, is Alpha Trion. Anyway, Alpha Trion manages to not only tell them what happened to all of the primes, but also reveal that everything that the Transformers knew was wrong. Sentinel Prime is not a prime. In fact, he is actually a traitor who decided to help the Quintessons destroy the primes. He even tried to take the Matrix of leadership for himself, but luckily the Matrix only works for someone who's worthy, and Sentinel Prime is definitely not worthy. So the Matrix of leadership literally just disappears, and since then, Sentinel Prime has been lying to all of the Transformers. In fact, after they're born, but before they come online, he surgically removes some of their core, making it so that some of the Transformers are Transformers, and the others are non-cogs, meaning they can't transform. And also, Sentinel Prime just passes off a bunch of the energon that the miners mine over to their sworn enemy, the Quintessons. So yeah, Sentinel Prime is literally a twist villain. Granted, he's not the main villain, because unfortunately, we all know that the story was supposed to be about how two best friends would eventually grow apart and become sworn enemies. So the second that Sentinel Prime showed up at the very start of the movie and gave a big heroic speech, I knew he was going to be the thing that breaks apart the two best friends and makes them sworn enemies. So anyway, that's exactly what he does. He fills the entire gang with rage, and at this point, Orion isn't really sure what to do, but he's thinking that the best thing they can do is prove the truth to everyone so that the Transformers will stop worshipping him as a hero. Meanwhile, D16 actually just wants to kill Sentinel Prime. And so the two of them are kind of split, but they decide that they should work together to go back to Iacon City with a bunch of proof that will paint Sentinel Prime as the bad guy. And when that happens, D16 will take over with his own plan to kill Sentinel Prime. But they don't really have a good way to get there, especially because they're just non-cogs. Luckily, Alpha Trion decides to give them the cogs of the former primes, so now our characters have the ability to transform and make their way back to Iacon City. So they leave Alpha Trion, and he has a final battle against a bunch of minions, but he's eventually captured by Arachnid, at which point he's tortured for information by Sentinel Prime, and when he doesn't hand it over, Sentinel Prime kills Alpha Trion, killing off the last of the true primes. So our main heroes are on their way back to Iacon City when they get captured by the Crown Guard, which is led by Starscream and also Soundwave and Shockwave. Oh, and if you're a Transformers fan, you will know about the not-so-subtle foreshadowing about how Soundwave and Shockwave thinks that Bumblebee talks too much. Anyway, we learn that the Crown Guard believes in the strongest should be the leader. You know, might makes right, stuff like that. So when D16 tries to walk out of there and then is stopped by Starscream, D16 ends up beating Starscream up, even going so far as to permanently change Starscream's voice so that he's always screaming in a high-pitched voice. And that's when Sentinel Prime attacks, and after a very ferocious battle, they end up capturing Starscream, D-16, and B-127, along with half of the Crown Guard, leaving the other half with Alita and Orion. And Alita manages to give a heroic speech about her bragging, and also talking some sense into Orion, who's beginning to doubt himself. And so Orion comes up with the plan to use the remaining half of the Crown Guard, as well as a bunch of the lowly miner workers who are non-cogs, so not Transformers. And he builds an army that it will attack Sentinel Prime and sneak into his headquarters, at which point they can then capture Arachnid and broadcast her memories across Iacon City, revealing that Sentinel Prime not only killed the Primes, but he also made a deal with the Quintessons to give them all of their hard-worked Energon, and in exchange, he lives like a king among the Transformers. So all of the Transformers band together to defeat Sentinel Prime. Before that happens, however, Sentinel Prime is having an interrogation with D-16 and B-127 and Starscream and the rest of the Crown Guard. And for some strange reason, D-16 has pretty much become a rage-filled monster. Everything that he thought he knew has been a lie. He looked up to Sentinel Prime as a hero, and now Sentinel Prime is a villain and responsible for killing his actual true hero, Megatronus Prime. In fact, D-16 literally wears a Megatronus sticker on his shoulder. And so Sentinel Prime, who sympathizes with D-16 about that, decides to make it so that D-16 can never remove the sticker. So he literally uses a blowtorch to burn the sticker into D-16's chest plate. And despite all that pain, D-16 refuses to bow down to Sentinel Prime. And that's when Orion Pax and also Alita managed to use their army to attack Sentinel Prime, and they even managed to dethrone him by revealing the truth. But despite all that, D-16 still tries to kill Sentinel Prime, because at this point, D-16 has pretty much just become a rage-filled monster who will never stop fighting for any reason, because his whole world has been shattered. So Orion tries to save Sentinel Prime from D-16, only for D-16 to shoot Orion. And just as Orion's body is about to fall off, D-16 catches him. But unfortunately, D-16 is just so filled with rage that at this point he says, Orion's gonna die, I'm done saving him. And so he lets Orion fall to his death. And so D-16 kills Sentinel Prime. He rips out Sentinel's core, which is actually Megatronus Prime's core. And so D-16 puts Megatronus's core into himself and becomes Megatron. And while Orion Pax dies, he falls to the center of Cybertron and is gifted the Matrix of Leadership. And he's risen as Optimus Prime. And the two of them end up getting into a final battle over leadership, with D-16 unlocking his famous cannon and Optimus unlocking his very famous Energon battle axe. The battle ends with Optimus slicing open Megatron's cannon, and the two best friends say goodbye and become enemies for life, as Optimus banishes D-16 and the rest of the Crown Guard, and eventually the Crown Guard decide to leave with Megatron, since he's technically the strongest, even though he was just beaten up by Optimus. And Optimus uses the Matrix of Leadership to fix the planet of Cybertron and make it so Energon is flowing freely once again. And thus the film ends with a little bit of a minor cliffhanger. And while you might think, yeah, this is supposed to be a prequel to the rest of the Transformers franchise, Optimus versus Megatron, woohoo! But in actuality, it's left on a cliffhanger because the creators want to tell the origin story over the course of an entire movie trilogy. In fact, the creators have already mapped out a rough idea of what they want the full trilogy to look like, and they're already working on the script, which, like the first movie, will be character-driven story. Unfortunately, it's not going to go into production unless the first movie is a box office success. but considering how great this movie is, and also how good the Transformers films do in theaters, I think it's safe to say that this movie is going to be a success, so don't be surprised if Transformers 2 is announced. But this is animation, so I would not be surprised if the film takes forever to come out. If you're wondering what the plot could be about, they did leave the Quintesson threat completely untouched in this movie, so maybe the Quintessons could be the main antagonist of the second movie, and we could also have to see Optimus try to fight against Megatron and his brand new army of Decepticons as an emotional struggle, because at this point in time, the young Optimus will most likely want to get his former best friend back. And I feel like the second movie will end with him finally giving up on their relationship, and he would evolve from the young and naive Optimus into the leader of the Autobots, Optimus Prime, that we all know and love. But with that in mind, I hope you guys enjoyed this review. Comment down below who your favorite Transformers character is, and if you enjoyed this video, consider supporting my membership tab by going to my membership page on my channel or clicking the join button down below. Or you can just do the free option and subscribe. With that in mind, I hope that you're staying safe out there, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye-bye.
Whoa! I got a battle mask! It appeared with this guy. Knife hands? I have knife hands!
I can see that. B, these are not the bad guys.
Why did you cut the door?
What? No, it was already like that. Right?
Yes, that's right.
Yes,
It was already like, yeah, that's right.